organization that was founded in 1977 to help promote the profession of rangering, if that's a word, and the spirit of rangers around the world. Also, we are there to support the mission goals of the National Park Service, and finally to provide some education for folks, both internal to the ranger profession and then external. And that's why we're here today. A few years ago, the Association of National Park Rangers set up a program with Royal Caribbean where they would put members like myself on board the ships to talk about Alaska, give you some information about Alaska. So that's why we're here today. A little bit about myself. My name is, like I said, Mark Tezel. I started working for the National Park Service in 1989. And I am now a retired park ranger. It's a little odd to say because it just happened. April of this year, I stopped working. All the government stuff going on, I stopped working. They continued to pay me. Today is my official retirement eligibility day. So we'll see how it goes. With the government maybe shutting down, things like that. But I started working at San Antonio Missions National Historical Park in 1989 as a park ranger there. That's my hometown, and you may be wondering why you have a Texan here talking to you about Alaska. Well, the last half of my career, I got involved in training in the Park Service, and because of that, I traveled extensively, especially to places like Alaska. So I have visited over 240 of the 430 units of the National Park Service, including most of them up here in Alaska, or where we're headed to in Alaska. So, and I have a bunch of students. In fact, we'll be meeting one of my students when we get to Skagway at Klondike Gold Rush National Historical Park. So they feed me a lot of information. I gather a lot of information, and we're going to talk about all that information over 3 presentations that I have aboard the ship this week. This one is one of my favorites. I call it the Promise of Alaska. And I sort of borrowed this from the Ken Burns miniseries on the National Park System. When they got into their Alaska section, they talked a lot about the promise that Alaska brought to us. It deals around the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, or we call it ANILCA. This was probably one of the greatest pieces of conservation and preservation legislation passed in the United States. We'll go through several others that were really good, and then in the 20th century, this is probably the big one for us. It's one of the primary reasons we're here. My theory is the reason we all get on cruise ships nowadays and head north to Alaska is because of ANILCA. And we'll talk about that as we go through this. Before ANILCA, Alaska was seen as a big wilderness, especially when we bought it from Russia. They thought it was a big wilderness, not much here. People didn't want to come up here. It's cold, it's snowy, it's icy. If you've been outside today, you know how bad it can get. But people didn't want to come up here. But when ANILCA came into place, people all of a sudden realized what the promise of Alaska really was. And ANILCA not only raised our awareness, but it added 157 million acres to the public land. Today is actually Public Lands Day as well, so it's a good time to talk about that. Further interest in our national resources that we have up in Alaska, as well as, like I said, increased tourism. Tourism has just exploded into Alaska because of ANILCA. So like I said, I'm going to talk about some of the other conservation efforts in the United States. And to do that, I want to go back to the Louisiana Purchase, 1803. And so, with the Louisiana Purchase, we all of a sudden, the land size of the United States exploded, right? And with large increases of land, way out west, Manifest Destiny, all this stuff going on, we had a huge, great wilderness that had no idea what was in it, right? So in 1804, Lewis and Clark set out on their tour of discovery to find out what we just bought, basically. And they went up the Missouri River system all the way out as far as they could go on that, crossed the Continental Divide out on the Snake and Columbia River system, made it all the way to this place, Astoria, Oregon today. This is Fort Clatsop in Lewis and Clark National Historical Park. This is where they spent the winter before heading back to St. Louis and that. And so if you ever read or learn more about the core discoveries in Lewis and Clark, it's really a big adventure into the unknown wilderness. And so it brought a little bit of awareness into this new great American wilderness that we had for ourselves. Fast forward a little bit. In the 1860s, a man named John Muir, most of you may have heard of him, walked from San Francisco to the newly discovered, at least for Europeans, Yosemite Valley. He thought he could get a job there. One of the owners of one of the hotels there was needing to hire people to work in the hotel, but also to help with grazing his sheep and stuff. We grazed sheep in Yosemite Valley back then. So John Muir arrives there, falls in love with this place. If you ever read John Muir's writings, you'll find out this is him. He really fell for this, and he became a vocal advocate for finding a way to conserve Yosemite. That happened in 1864 with the Yosemite grant. The United States government granted Yosemite Valley and a few other areas around the valley to the state of California, with the primary reasons being for public use. Not just public use, but maybe to stop grazing and timber harvesting and things like that, but the primary reason was for tourism. Again, people were starting to hear about this place, wanting to see it, and they wanted to make sure that it was preserved for tourism and for conservation reasons as well. Then, there's a few more pieces of legislation, but other people start finding out about, or learning about the cause to conserve our new great American wilderness out there. And so the story goes that a group of trappers were up in the northern area of southern area of Montana, northern area of Wyoming, wandered into what we now call Yellowstone, and saw the amazing features there. And so one night on their trip into the Yellowstone, they sat along the Madison River at the west end of Yellowstone and made a pact of themselves. They started talking, what are we going to do with this place? A couple of them said, let's put claims on it, we can profit off of this. Most of them started thinking, and eventually they came to the conclusion that they should work to make sure that this special place was preserved for everybody to come, not to turn it into a big tourist attraction or anything, or tourist trap. It's going to become a tourist attraction. But yet, to preserve what we had there in that wilderness area. And so, 1872, President Ulysses S. Grant signs an act to establish Yellowstone National Park. It's the first national park in the world, and it was set aside, again, to preserve not only the thermodynamic features that are there, but also in the wildlife and everything like that, but also we were there to preserve this place so people can come and see it for future generations. And so Yellowstone, established in 1872. A lot of this stuff that's going on with Yellowstone, we're also starting to talk about with Yosemite. Yosemite sort of got a little bit ahead with the Yosemite grant. Eventually, Yosemite becomes a national park, actually after Sequoia. Sequoia was the second national park. But then Yosemite becomes a national park, and we start gathering some national parks together. Another key piece of legislation to help preserve and conserve what we have in the United States is the Act for the Preservation of American Antiquities, which we call the Antiquities Act. So as people start moving out west and seeing not only the natural wonders, but also a lot of the cultural wonders, like Indian dwellings or Native American dwellings out there, A lot of concern started popping up about people looting it. In other countries around the world, people may go into a site and just start taking stuff home as a treasure hunter. We wanted to stop that from happening. So the Antiquities Act was signed into law by President Theodore Roosevelt in 1906. What it does is says on federal land, which remember the west of the United States is mostly federal land, especially at this time, you are not allowed to go in and excavate or remove any type of artifacts, objects, whatever, without a special permission from the government. And even when you do, you cannot just take them home for yourself. They have to go into a museum, be preserved, or another place where they can be preserved and displayed if necessary. So that's the Antiquities Act. A big piece of the Antiquities Act, especially when it comes to Alaska, is the fact that it gives the authority to the President of the United States to, by presidential proclamation, proclaim a national monument on any federal land. So with a stroke of a pen, the President can now say, this place on federal land is a national monument, and it has even more restrictions on it. The first one to happen was right after the Antiquities Act was established, was Devil's Tower National Monument in Wyoming. So Wyoming has the first national park and the first national monument in its boundaries. Devil's Tower is a really cool place to go. It's a sacred site for the indigenous people around there. So if you ever get a chance to go see Devil's Tower, that's a cool place to go. So that's, we now have a few national monuments, a few national parks out there, and no way to organize them or administer them. Yellowstone was run by the Army. If you go to Yellowstone, go up to Mammoth Hot Springs, you'll see Fort Yellowstone. That was the Army base that ran Yellowstone. Some of the other parks were run by the Department of the Interior from Washington, so there wasn't much presence on the ground right there. So we really had a disorganized system of parks. With that, a man named Stephen T. Mather comes into play. He was a wealthy borax miner based in Chicago, and he started to get interest in the national parks. He hooked up with Murr a couple of times, found out about some parks, visited some of them, and as he went through, he fell in love with them, of course, and started to see the problems we had with our system of national parks. So he writes to his friend, Franklin Lane, who happens to be the Secretary of the Interior, and says, you need to do something about this. We cannot, the Army's shooting buffalo for target practice because that's where they're based. Things like that. Nothing against the Army, but that's what they're doing. And so Franklin Lane writes back to Stephen Mather and says, if you don't like it, come to Washington and fix it. So he does. So he goes to Washington. He becomes the de facto director of the National Park Service. There is no National Park Service yet. He starts working on fixing this, and he also starts working on lobbying some of his friends in Congress to make a new organization to help protect the national parks. So in 1916, the National Park Service Organic Act is created. And that takes all those parks, puts them into a system. Stephen Mather becomes the first director of that, and we now have a system of national parks around the world. The National Park Service Organic Act is almost poetic in the way it says what we're supposed to do. It's very short, but it says the agency created therein is to preserve the cultural and natural resources of our country in such a way that they are left unimpaired for future generations, in perpetuity. So the Park Service's main mission is to make sure we preserve everything so my grandkids, their grandkids, all of them in perpetuity have a place to go to see all this. Just as a side note, about a little less than 20 years before this, a man named Guilford Pinchot, who was another big conservationist, along with John Muir, really had a disagreement with Muir and said we should not be conserving them to this level. We should be using some of these lands, multi-purpose use of the lands. Gilbert Pinchot became the father of the National Forest Service, the Forest Service in the United States Department of Agriculture. So whenever you hear someone asking what's the difference between a national park and a national forest, we're actually in two different departments. National Park Service is the Department of the Interior, Forest Service is the Department of Agriculture. Park Service, like it says in the slang in the Organic Act, is there to conserve and protect for future generations. We're not going to start using stuff up. In the Forest Service, they're there for multiple purposes. We are to preserve some of the things there, but we're also to harvest timber, provide for recreation, things like that. So that's why you can go hunting in a national forest, you can't in a national park. All right, so that's what's happening down in the lower 48, all the way up until the early 20th century. Let's back up a little bit to 1867. At this time, what we now call Alaska was a part of Russia. Russia claimed ownership to it. We will get to a heavily Russian area on Tuesday at Sitka. We'll talk a little bit about that. But at Sitka was where the governor of Russia was. There's a Russian cathedral, Russian bishop's house. That's where Russia was stationed. William H. Seward, who was the Secretary of State at the time, worked out a deal with Russia. And for $7.2 million, he was going to buy all of Alaska. So actually, there's the check that we wrote to Russia. So after 60 years after the Louisiana Purchase, we all of a sudden doubled the size of the country again, or tripled the size of the country again, explodes again. And we buy Russian settlements and take it, and some of the indigenous people in the southern area of Alaska called Alaska, that is Anglicanized to become Alaska, and we now have Department of Alaska for this new district that we have, a huge area. And then once again, we have a brand new wilderness to look at in the United States. People called it Seward's Folly. Most people didn't have much of an opinion of it. Some supported it, but it's way up there north, out of our way. And it's not a problem for us. We didn't pay that much for it, so okay, we'll do that. But there were those opponents who were against buying Alaska from Russia, and they called it, of course, Seward's Folly. Like I said, now we have a brand new wilderness. Most people considered it unusable land. If you've ever been north in Alaska in the wintertime, doesn't look like there's much there. It's just frozen country. This is actually in Denali National Park in January of 2021. And so we, it's just looks like a big frozen wasteland with beautiful mountains, lots of wildlife and things like that, but no foreseeable interest, no assets that we wanted to mine from it. So there wasn't much interest in Alaska in the lower 48 states. That changes rapidly. In 1896, gold was discovered along the Yukon River in the Klondike area on the Klondike River in the Yukon of Canada, and all of a sudden, people start getting interested in it. Not necessarily in Alaska, but Alaska was in the way of getting to the Yukon. So people started stampeding there. We'll be at Klondike Gold Rush National Historical Park on Monday, I believe, if days are right. That is at Skagway, Alaska, and so you'll see a lot of the remnants of this gold rush up into the mountains. So all of a sudden now, people have a lot of interest in Alaska. Not for the resources that are in Alaska, but because it takes them to the Yukon so they can get in and mine for gold. That wanes really quickly. So Skagway booms and then shrinks down again. Another town near Skagway that you'll probably may be able to see some point, Dyea, only lasts a few months, but it booms down. But there's 2 trails that were taken up, the Chilkoot Trail and the White Pass route. And so if you're going on the railroad, when we get to Skagway, you'll be taking the White Pass route up to into Canada. It wanes pretty quickly, but then again in 1899, people are now sort of interested in this, and so there's a gold rush in Nome, Alaska. And a few years later, in early 1900s, Fairbanks has a gold rush. So now all of a sudden people are thinking, okay, this is not necessarily a barren wasteland. There is something good about Alaska. In 1890, Alaska gets its first national park unit. It's called Sitka Park. And it tells the story of that Russian community that was there, but also with their conflict with the Tlingit people who were there way before the Russians were. So it's a really interesting story to see. We'll talk about this tomorrow morning a little bit more. We talk about the CCC's work in Sitka and then how they preserve some of the stuff. When you get to Sitka, this is the Russian bishop's house. This is what the Orthodox bishop of the Russian church resided, had chapel and things like that. Just down the street is the main part of Sitka National Historical Park, where they have a beautiful totem trail with totem poles. Like I said, we'll talk a little bit more about that. So it's a great place to see. So that's the first park unit to be founded in Alaska. Then, in 1917, 1 year after we get the National Park Service, Mount McKinley National Park is developed. And the really important thing to understand about Mount McKinley National Park is it was not established to preserve the mountain. All of the legislation behind it says it's there to preserve the wildlife. In fact, the mountain peak was not in the original boundaries of the national park. So Mount McKinley becomes a national park. There's a lot of commotion about it in Alaska because they did not name it for the indigenous name for the mountain, which is Denali, but it was named for President McKinley by a prospector who was passing through this way. He managed to get the Ohio delegation of Congress on board with this, and that became officially named Mount McKinley over the objections to just about everybody in Alaska. A few years later, 1912, actually a few years before 1912, a volcano in southwestern Alaska, south of Anchorage, called Nova Rupta erupted and basically laid this barren land you see here out there. Fumaroles started steaming up out of the ash from the eruption of Nova Rupta, and this became known as the Valley of 10,000 Smokes. And so a few years later, in 1918, you see here, Katmai National Monument was created by presidential proclamation to preserve this Valley of 10,000 Smokes. So it becomes the third national park site in the in Alaska, and the first national monument to be claimed here. Same thing happened a few years later in 1925. Glacier Bay becomes a national monument. It's very small, mainly around the bay itself. If you ever get a chance to go into Glacier Bay, it's very magical. But the Park Service only allows a few ships a year to go in, so you have to find the right crews to do it. But Glacier Bay was designated not again for the scenery, but for the wildlife and everything else around it. And so Glacier Bay National Monument sets out. In fact, a few years before, John Hopkins Glacier, which you saw on the first slide here, actually had some massive cave-ins, icebergs flowing into Glacier Bay, so tourism went dead for about 2 decades because of what was happening in Glacier Bay. So that's 1925. For the next 40 years, nothing happens as far as national parks and conservation, things like that in Alaska. But a couple of other things happen that sort of spurs us to get to ANILCA, the Alaska National Lands Conservation Act. 1959, Eisenhower signs the law creating Alaska as the 49th state. I don't know if they have it in Juneau. They probably have the 49th State Brewery. If you want a beer, that's a great place to go when you get to Juneau. But yeah, they're proud to be the 49th state. Not only did they make Alaska a state, but they were concerned again about indigenous rights throughout Alaska. With all this vast land and people spread out all over the place, we wanted to make sure that these folks still had the right to use the land. So a lot of language was put into the Alaska Statehood Act, making sure that there were safeguards for Native Alaskan sites and traditions, that they could continue to carry on those traditions. That kept going until 1968, and oil was discovered in Prudhoe Bay. And so now we got a new sort of gold rush, but now it's black gold, because we realize there's vast amounts of oil, especially up in the north of Alaska, above the Arctic Circle. So Phillips Petroleum discovers the oil. New attention comes here because we want to drill, get the oil back down to the States. You know, we talk about the Alaskan pipeline, things like that. How are we going to extract these resources out of Alaska? So now it becomes a big concern for everyone in the conservation movement and a lot of folks in Alaska as well. In 1971, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act is passed to help address some of the concerns. And what it does is it allows the Secretary of the Interior to withdraw from development certain lands that are necessary for indigenous use within 90 days of passage of the act. So he has to act real quick to withdraw from development of those lands. But we're now preserving some of those indigenous sites for them to use in perpetuity. Additionally, the Secretary of the Interior was allowed to set aside up to 80 million acres for preservation purposes for other uses, not necessarily directly related to indigenous sites, but to withdraw them from development, and these were called D2 lands. The caveat about the D2 lands is they had a sunset provision in it. So once the Secretary of the Interior withdrew those lands, they became preserved up for a period of time unless Congress acted to preserve them further. So we had a sunset clause that we started worrying about. That really starts to come to fruition, or the issue of the sunset clause comes into President Carter's term. In 1978, those D2 lands were going to about ready to sunset. Congress was not doing its job, believe it or not. And so they were squabbling over what they wanted to do with the D2 lands, how many they wanted to keep, things like that. All of a sudden, President Carter realizes they're not going to get it done in time. So he goes back all the way to the Antiquities Act that Theodore Roosevelt signed, and with a stroke of a pen, he created 17 national monuments with over 56 million acres in them. So there was a lot of commotion about that, as you can imagine. Some folks in Alaska hated it. In fact, they would go after the park rangers that were there. Some people loved it, and some people were, again, sort of in the middle. But all of a sudden, with a stroke of a pen, 56 million acres in land was set aside as national monuments. Some of it was like a Newton Finale National Monument surrounded Mount McKinley National Park. There was other national monuments created, like this one here, Kenai Fjords, which is in Seward, Alaska. And so now we doubled the Park Service size almost overnight with a stroke of a pen. That, like I said, created a lot of issues for folks, but they wanted to make sure that they could make the people that wanted to conserve the land wanted to make sure that it was more permanent than just by presidential proclamation. So in 1980, November of 1980, President Carter loses his bid for a second term. The Democrats lose the Senate to the Republicans, and so they realize they don't have much time to act. President Reagan probably is not going to act on the national monuments. So quickly, this is one time when Congress really moved quickly, they passed the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act. Not only did they take all those national monument lands, put them into National Park Service, a lot of them, they upped them to national parks, not national monuments. Others, the national monuments, they said this is a national monument, but Congress has put a stamp of approval on them, things like that. And so now, again, the Park Service just explodes. It exploded does. So Mount McKinley National Park is combined with Denali National Monument. Some extra lands are added into a national preserve, and is now entitled the Denali National Park and Preserve at 4.74 million acres out there. The other parks in Alaska, Glacier Bay is again expanded just like Denali was. It added some preserve lands around it, named Glacier Bay National Park and Preserve, and now we're up to 3.2 million acres out there. Katmai National Park is expanded beyond the Valley of 10,000 Smokes. It now includes where most people go. When we went there, we go to Brooks Falls. And this is where the bears, the Alaskan brown bears, go to feed on salmon every year. There's a short river between two lakes at Katmai. The salmon have to jump this one set of falls to get up to their spawning grounds, and the bears know that. And then you can just sit there for hours and watch this happening. It's an amazing feat, and it's a place where people and bears live together most of the time. So, yeah, if you ever get a chance to get there, it's not on the road system, so it's a little bit harder to get out there. New national parks, national monuments, and preserves are there. At ANILCA National Preserve, Monument and Preserve was added with about 600,000 acres, a little over 600,000 acres. It includes some more volcanic features, include this crater right here, ANILCA crater. Bering Land Bridge preserves some of the remnants of the Bering Land Bridge. And so Bering Land Bridge National Preserve at 2.7 million acres out there. Cape Christiansborg National Monument. It preserves a diverse Arctic coastland way up in the Arctic of Alaska at 2.7 million acres again. Gates of the Arctic National Park and Preserve, the northernmost national park in the United States at over 8 million acres, is preserved at Brooks Range and some of the other areas of the Arctic, above the Arctic Circle for preservation. Kenai Fjords National Monument becomes Kenai Fjords National Park. If you ever get a chance to go to Alaska, Seward is where Kenai Fjords is. It's just south of Anchorage. It's an easy drive. You can take the Alaska Railroad. It's a beautiful area to see. It preserves the Harding Ice Field, which is the size of Connecticut. And all the glaciers that feed off of that ice field down into the fjords, into the ocean. Kobuk Valley National Park set aside for some 100-foot high sand dunes out there. So it's up near Nome and that, or Kotzebue in that area. It also includes caribou migration routes, which are important for the caribou. Lake Clark National Park, another one southwest of Anchorage. You can only get to it by seaplane or boat, but it has some beautiful coastlines. Large Lake Clark, which is about the size of Connecticut, the lake itself. Two volcanoes there, Mount Redoubt and Mount Iliamna, I always say that wrong, are preserved within the park. And if you may remember, way back in 2009, Mount Redoubt erupted and caused all sorts of havoc for Anchorage Airport. Noatak National Park and Preserve, it set aside 6.6 million acres up there, north of the Arctic Circle, and it is one of the places that is least affected by human activity. Two rivers in that area are the least affected rivers by human activity in the country. The largest national park in the country, Wrangell-St. Elias National Park and Preserve. It's east of Anchorage on the road system at 13.175 million acres. It is larger than 13 states. They have mining activities here. This is the Kennecott Mine, which you can drive up to and hike into to see. They also have glacial systems throughout it. It preserves the Wrangell Mountain Range and the St. Elias Mountain Range. And then finally, the last new park was Yukon-Charlie Rivers National Preserve. Again, this is north of Fairbank, right across the highway from Gates of the Arctic. It's not on the road system, though, so you have to hike in there, take a float in there. It preserves most of the Yukon River Basin in the United States and all of the Charlie River Basin in the United States. Preserve those river systems out there. So not only did ANILCA affect the national park system, it affected the national forest system away as well. Almost 3.35 million acres were added to two national forests in Alaska, the Tongass and the Chugach. Chugach is up near Anchorage on the mainland, south of Anchorage. The Tongass, we're sailing into it right now. Most of our trip through Alaska, we're going to be surrounded by the Tongass National Forest. It is the largest national forest in the United States. And not only does it have regular forest lands, but also two national monuments were given to the National Forest Service to administer, and that's at Misty Fjords and Admiralty Island. And as we go up towards Juneau, Admiralty Island will be on the left side of the boat. And this place right here, Mendenhall Glacier. When we get to Juneau, if you don't have anything to do, or maybe you have one of your excursions, head out to Mendenhall Glacier. It's a beautiful site. There's trails there. It's the most visited visitor center in the National Forest System. So it's a great place to go hiking and spend some time enjoying the view of the glacier. Beside National Forest, the National Wildlife Refuge system was expanded a lot, including adding about 9.8 million acres to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge north of the Arctic Circle to help protect the environment for the caribou and others. So it explodes there. New national wildlife refuges were created. This is the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge near Seward. It was created to protect some of those lands and vital habitat for some of the animals around South Alaska. So that, like I said, happened overnight almost. So what's the future? There's still some disagreement about ANILCA. You'll hear it on the news from time to time. They want to open up the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge to drilling, things like that. There's folks in Alaska were almost dead set against it for the longest time. But if you watch the Ken Burns special on the National Park System, you'll see one of the local leaders in Seward, Alaska. They interview her, and she talks about how she fought against ANILCA until she saw what happens, because now Seward's become a major cruise port. People are coming in there. It's revitalized the town. So it's like the third gold rush to hit Alaska. Now we have a gold rush of tourism. Like I said, that's why we're headed up there as well. One of the big things about Alaska is that we're privileged to have a lot of land to deal with. So even if the politicians make a decision to open ANWR to drilling, there's still a lot of land out there. As long as we make sure that we are preserving some of these places for future generations, I think we're going to be okay with it. Who knows, but I'm a little bit optimistic about the whole thing. So that's what I have right now. Thanks everybody for joining us. If you have any questions, I'll be around here for a few minutes to answer them for you. Also, I put some notes on a website, so if you want to scan that QR code, you can get to that. The other one is the official National Park Service app. Like I said, we're going to Sitka and we're going to Klondike Gold Rush. Both of those have some walking tours of the parks and the surrounding area. So you can download that and just do a walking tour of Skagway or Sitka. So those are there to help you. So again, thanks for joining us this morning, and I'll be back tomorrow to talk more about Sitka. Thanks, everybody.